everybody, and welcome back to MajorLeagueFishing.com. I'm Lynn Burkhead, sitting alongside 2013 Bassmaster Classic champ and newly minted Major League Fishing pro Cliff Pace. And Cliff, let's talk about one of your favorite techniques, swimming a jig. Swimming a jig has really come on in recent years. It's one of the most effective techniques out there. I like to think about it. You can almost, it's like fishing a spinnerbait in a place you can't fish a spinnerbait.
It really is, and it also applies in other things. Swimming a jig is very effective anytime you have shallow fish, and it doesn't necessarily have to imply a super thick cover. I swim a jig a lot in open water. It doesn't necessarily entail that it has to be super thick cover, but it does excel in super thick cover, which is one thing that makes it just that much more versatile. But swimming a jig for me is exactly what you're basically saying. It's just like fishing a spinnerbait with the blades removed. I'm normally going to throw it at or around targets, in and around under boat docks, boat slips, shoreline vegetation, basically anything you think may harbor a bass. The thing I like about swimming a jig over throwing a spinnerbait a lot of the times is there's certain times of the year where even in open water that fish start to get sensitive to the vibration and the strong impulses.
Right.
You know, a lot of us get on a really good spinnerbait bite on this one particular day. We go fishing and the wind's blowing 40 miles an hour and it's cloudy, and we go out there and you can break the wire on 5 spinnerbaits in 2 hours. And you think, you know, this is the deal. And you go out there tomorrow and it's slick and sunny and they won't touch it. That's when swimming a jig comes into play for me. Swimming a jig is basically like fishing a spinnerbait, but it's more of a finesse style when it comes to open water. The other attribute that swimming a jig offers is, like I said earlier, about the cover. You know, you can throw a swimming jig in basically any kind of cover you want. You know, I throw it on a pretty good sized heavy action rod.
How big a rod?
And this is a 7'2" rod. I don't like a rod that's much longer than that, me personally, because casting a swimming jig does require accuracy. When I get much beyond a 7'2" rod, I start to lose that accuracy. But a 7'2" rod gives me the power that I need to remove the fish from cover, but also gives me the length that I'm comfortable with. And that's something everybody needs to figure out for their own personal self. You know, don't look at me and say, he's a 7'2" rod, that's what I need. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying use a rod that's strong enough to remove the fish from cover, but short enough to give you casting accuracy. We all know that the longer a rod becomes, the less accurate you get with it at a certain level. So, you know, don't try to do it with a rod that's just too much, too overbearing. Normally, always when I swim a jig, around covers with braided line. Sometimes in open water, you know, I will use a fluorocarbon line or braid with a fluorocarbon leader, just because the fish aren't in and around very thick grass or thick wood, and I think the line becomes an issue. It maybe reduces the amount of bites that I get in the course of a day. But swimming a jig is one of those things that has gotten extremely popular in the last 3 to 5 years. I will tell you, it was much better 10 years ago. But it is still very, very good. It's a technique that'll be around forever. It's a technique that you can apply on any body of water at any point in time that there's fish in that 0 to 5 foot range. No matter, you know, some bodies of water obviously are much more suited. Typically your river systems, your lakes with lots of shoreline vegetation are going to be more suited. But I promise you, I have caught a tremendous amount of fish swimming a jig in lakes you would consider to be a rock quarry. It doesn't have to be grass. It doesn't have to be cover. It's a lot of times it's just simply the presentation.
Talking about the presentation, how do you retrieve it? Is it as simple as throwing it at the target and then just reeling it back in, or are you very
No, unfortunately in our sport nothing's ever that simple. And I retrieve it. It's really just a game of experimentation. No different from some days when you are catching them cranking, they want you to reel it as fast as you can turn the handle. And some days they won't bite it unless you reel it and stop. And it's the same thing swimming a jig or anything else, throwing a spinnerbait. I'm normally going to try to let the jig, especially if I'm throwing it like to isolated targets, say a stump or the corner of a boathouse or one individual piece of grass. When the jig clears that piece of grass, normally I'm going to do one or two things. Either I'm going to let it pause and kind of flutter and see if a fish is there that's just not super aggressive, that's going to eat it before it gets away, or I'm going to take the opposite approach and I'm going to speed it up to make that fish feel like it's now or never. And once you kind of figure out what mood they want that day or that hour, just stick with it. And if you know, that's the beautiful thing about swimming a jig, is swimming a jig gives you the ability to cover a tremendous amount of water. So once you can figure out how to make a fish trigger and put it in his mouth, you can put the trolling motor on high and just go and throw and get around enough of them and make him work and have a good day on the water.
I noticed you got a shad color tied on there. I would imagine you also tie some bluegill patterns on at times. What color selections do you make?
I have a pretty, I mean, this is just a basic pure white. I mean, you say a shad pattern, this jig is just nothing more. It's a jig that is designed for swimming. It's nothing but a solid white skirt. And I typically put the solid white trailer on it. I don't know what it is about white and a spinnerbait or in swimming a jig. I'm assuming it's a shad thing, but it's definitely effective. But pretty much any color jig that you can imagine can work. Swimming if it's a color, if you're on a body of water, if you're home body of water, they really like a green pumpkin colored jig flipping. They're probably about a green pumpkin colored jig swimming. A lot of times it's just really about the environment that they're in and what they're accustomed to eating. But yeah, definitely all your shad patterns, definitely your bluegill patterns. And bluegill patterns can even run into some of the darker stuff like black and blue, some of your brown and oranges and stuff. The main thing with me is I either want it to be loud or I want it to be natural.
Okay.
One or the other.
Talk to me about the hook set. When they take it, is there anything different between a swim jig and say a flipping jig?
Not normal, other than normally it's a distance thing. A lot of times swimming a jig, I might cast it 50, 60 yards, and they'll eat it on the first 2 foot of the retrieve. And when they're that far away, you've got to jerk. When you're flipping 6 foot from the trolling motor, you don't have to jerk that hard,
right?
Because you don't have that distance to cover and that amount of line to cover. But no, the main thing with it is you just want to make sure to let them get the bait. Just like you would with a spinnerbait or a topwater bait, you want to make sure you give the fish time to get the bait and turn, and then set the hook like you normally would. And most of the time, you're going to be successful.
One last question: do you modify your bait in any way? Do you trim the
Yeah,
hook
I
guard?
will, depending on what I'm doing with the jig. I vary the weight of my swimming jigs from a 1/4 to a 1/2 ounce. Not normally for depth issues, but for cover issues. And that can get a little complicated and hard to understand without explanation. But there's some situations where, like say shoreline vegetation, like water willow is a great example. It's real stalky, has a lot of cover up above the water. And if you throw this 1/4 ounce swimming jig in water willow, you're hardly ever going to make it touch the water. It's going to continuously be coming up out of the water, coming over the branch, the little twigs and stems of the plants. And then I'll go to, say, a 1/2 ounce. Something that will break through as I'm reeling it. Something that will prevent the bait from coming up out of the water.
Gotcha.
I use a lighter jig around less cover and a heavier jig around more. And typically for me, a 1/4 or a 3/8 fits the bill. There's very few situations where I really feel like I have to have a 1/2.
That's a great bunch of advice on swimming a jig from one of the best anglers on the planet, 2013 Bassmaster Classic champion and Major League Fishing pro, Cliff Pace. For more information like this, be sure to visit MajorLeagueFishing.com.